Grammarly can help you write quickly and confidently.
Ela, are you able to hear? Davina, you can hear me, can you?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
yeah, we can, Ellen.
So something must be wrong with Ela's system, although she was hearing when she first came on. Just apologies, everyone. Ela Gandhi is the chair of this, but there seems to be some problem with her sound system. We're just trying to sort it out, so please bear with us for a few more minutes.
Hello?
Hello, yes?
Is that Alan?
This is Alan. For some reason, Ela's system has just stopped. Ela is supposed to be chairing, but she can't hear anything. So we may have to start without Ela soon if we can't get her system sorted out. I apologize for that. Welcome, Maria. Nice
Alan,
to see you join us.
It's David Fig calling. I just dialed in, and that's the only way I could get your voice.
So Ela was talking before. Hello, Ela, we can now hear you. Yeah. Can you hear us?
Restart your computer completely and then log on again.
What?
We're ready to start, Ela, if you're ready to go.
No, I can't. But I thought that there was something.
Okay, so seeing as Ela's having some technical problems, I suggest we start and then hopefully she'll be able to log in soon. Thank you everyone for joining this very special event, which was initiated by Ela Gandhi and the Gandhi Development Trust, and then is also co-sponsored by the World Future Council, by the Phoenix Settlement Trust, and I think the Abolition 2000 Youth Network is involved in here also. And this is a special event looking at peace and disarmament in Africa and the world. So it's connecting some of these ideas from the African continent and also how they link in with peace processes internationally. Ela's now just redialed in. Ela, can you hear us now? Ela, do you have any sound? Okay, so I suggest that we continue then, and then once Ela's system gets sorted out, we can turn back to her. And I'll just step in and help to facilitate this event until we can sort out the technical things from Ela's end. And so this is September the 3rd, or September the 2nd, depending on which part of the world you're in, was the end of the Second World War. That's when the final battles in the Pacific area finished. The European War had finished a little bit earlier. And this was then the launch of a new hope for peace and no more, and also the United Nations, which had actually been established a little bit earlier in June, but hadn't yet had its first sitting or its first meeting. So this event is to commemorate sort of both of those, the end of the world wars and the start of the United Nations, the dawn of hope for peace. But then seeing that peace is not a final destination, but a road that we all have to walk on together and help each other. We're bringing together some people who have been involved in peace and disarmament from Africa and from around the world to advance some of this. Ela, can you hear us yet?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so let me pass over to you, Ela, as the chair, and you can do the introduction and then introduce the first speaker. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, welcome to all our eminent panelists today, and welcome to all of you in the audience. We are deeply honored that amongst us are a number of eminent religious leaders, parliamentarians, academic experts, civil society leaders in the fields of peace, disarmament, and the environment, and some are from our own organizations. We appreciate your participation and support. May I ask all of us to observe a moment of silence in memory of those who are no longer with us, some because of nuclear attacks and disasters over the years, some who have been snatched away by COVID-19 pandemic, others who have suffered violent attacks, whether in war situations or within their homes and communities. These are all unwarranted deaths, largely due to our own reckless behavior. Let us pray that we will be able to sufficiently influence the powers that be to stop the violence, to stop the experimentation with atomic energy, and concentrate on building a beautiful, safe, and healthy world for all. Let us pray. Thank you. Today we observe the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II and the birth of the United Nations. After the virtually failed effort of the League of Nations in curbing war, the people of the world sought to build a body to promote the resolution of disputes through negotiations and not war. The clear message was that the governments of the various countries of the world must invest in improving people's lives and not in wars. We come together to discuss how our lives are affected by nuclear proliferation and mass production and possession of armaments. We look at the effects these activities have on our people and on the environment. And we look at these issues from the point of view of women and of our youth. This webinar is organized by 4 organizations, all working for nonviolence and justice. Their names are on the invitation, so I won't go into that. But we invite all of you to join us in a massive campaign against wars and weapons of mass destruction and divert the funds to providing the necessities of life to the people of this world. This webinar is also held in support of the call made consistently year after year since 1977 by the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks. The Hibakusha, who are now 75 years and over, for a world free of nuclear production. This webinar will explore contemporary threats to peace and justice in South Africa, the African continent, and globally, with a focus on the risks and impacts of nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, and war. It will highlight the need to redirect resources from militarism to peace, public health, and sustainable development, especially in this time of COVID-19. And it will provide inspiring examples of actions by youth, women, faith-based communities, and the United Nations to address these issues. We have here a panel of eminent leaders in these fields. We have people from various countries, a number of youth leaders, and prominent academics who have creatively and robustly moved towards seeking to correct the course taken by the powers that be. Their brief biographies will be on the screen when they speak. So I would like to call the first speaker, Dr. Maria Espinosa, who was former president of UN General Assembly and one of the key people involved in the UN peace, SDG, and COVID-19 recovery agendas. She will give us an idea of the global scene at present. Over to you, Dr. Espinosa.
Thank you very, very much. It is indeed a true honor to be here today to join you in celebrating the legacy of Mahatma Gandhi for his contribution to a true culture of peace and nonviolence, and also, of course, for upholding human dignity and rights. Today, we also gather to commemorate the end of the Second World War, September 2nd, and in some parts of the world, it's still September 2nd, of course, and the birth of hope for global peace. And we are also, of course, commemorating the 75th anniversary of the creation and founding of the United Nations. And I would like, of course, to start by thanking Ela Gandhi, a granddaughter of Mahatma Gandhi and founder of the Gandhi Development Trust and co-president of Religions for Peace. And to all the speakers with us today, especially I would like to acknowledge my dear friend Aline Ware, Global Coordinator of Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, and a fellow counselor of the World Future Council. Thank you. And I think that as only the fourth woman to preside over the UN General Assembly in 75 years, I will be remiss if I do not acknowledge the first woman president, Madame Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, a national of India. And like Vijay Lakshmi, the man we celebrate today was a first, leading the way in ways that have inspired generations to do better, and whose name and image evoke the very concepts of peace, restraint, and tolerance, even in the face of violence and extremism. We need so much of Gandhi's wisdom today. So Gandhi's words are so true and so powerful today. And I quote him: peace will not come out of a clash of arms, but out of justice lived and done by unarmed nations in the face of odds. And I close the quote. And today, if you allow me, I would like to touch on the current challenges, on a very important part of the peace agenda, of the disarmament agenda, and which is the women, peace, and security agenda. And to insist that there is no sustaining peace, there is no culture of peace without full and equal participation of women. I think that amid this unprecedented global crisis, we should start by honoring all lives that were lost because of the COVID pandemic, as you very well said at the beginning, dear Ela. And, and also to say that peace is not only the synonym of harmony, of security and well-being for all, but it should be also a synonym of equality and non-discrimination. Peace cannot become a reality if we exclude women and girls, half of the world's population. So this year, they were already mentioned, but there are 3 international milestones this year, and that I think it is a good time for reflection. 75 years since the United Nations Charter was signed, 25 years since the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and its plan for action, and 20 years since the Women, Peace and Security Agenda was established with the adoption of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, which, of course, as we all know, reinforces the critical role of women in preventing conflict and sustaining peace. So historically, us women have been the most affected by war and conflicts, but also the most engaged in fruitful peace processes. You know, long before, and we have to remember that, long before the United Nations was established, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was formed as a response to the horrors of the First World War in 1915. And at the time, more than 1,200 women were advocating for women's rights to make decisions in matters of peace and security. In '69, the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, questioned whether women and children should be afforded special protection during conflicts. And in '74, we had, as we all know, the UN General Assembly adopting this declaration on the protection of women and children in emergency and armed conflict. And we know very well the history between 75 and 95. World conferences on women marked significant turning points among others, to recognize women as powerful agents for peace. In '75, we saw the first demands for greater women participation in security issues, and they were formally presented in the Mexico meeting. 10 years later in Nairobi, the same perspective, considering multidimensional operations supporting peace and the role of women. And Beijing, of course, demanding, and the Platform for Action in Beijing, the incorporation of more women at the highest levels of decision-making positions in peace and security matters. And we see 75 years have passed since the end of the Second World War and the signing of the Charter. I think it was, as we all know, it was the birth of a new era of a pioneer political global pact to prevent and protect us from the scourge of war, to defend human rights and promote development. That's why the UN exists, the very raison d'etre of the UN. But the history of the UN is at the same time the history of women's rights. And women's rights and dignity have been at the center of the global political agenda. Hundreds of norms, convention, policy, the same as the disarmament agenda that we all know. And women's rights agenda has had incremental progress, but also some regressions. And we are witnessing some regressions in women's rights and in the women, peace and security agenda, even today. If we look at the numbers, they're staggering. 35 million women are in need, 35 million in need of humanitarian aid and protection. At least 1 out of 5 refugee women experience sexual violence, and only 28% of humanitarian need articulate a differentiated need and impact on women and girls in situations of crisis. So there is a lot of work ahead of us. We have seen the data. The COVID-19 crisis would produce serious regressions on gender equality and women's rights. The pandemic has magnified the structural inequalities and violence that affects disproportionately women and girls, which hopefully would translate also into bolder action. So with that said, I think that we're all acutely aware that peace is more than the absence of war. It's a common phrase, but sustaining peace, should encompass not only preventing outbreak, escalation, continuation, and recurrence of conflict, but should address exclusion, discrimination, injustice, inequality, and structural violence. So I think that peace and sustainable development are symbiotic, complementary, and mutually reinforcing. And I think that as we have seen numbers and facts, gender equality is a stronger predictor of a state peacefulness. And there are a myriad of studies and data about that. If we look only at the Global Peace Index, we will see that that is a reality. More gender equality and women's rights and empowerment of women, and less likely to have situations of conflict and insecurity at the global level. And that of course, it's true in situations of conflict, in the very low rate of participation of women in peacekeeping missions, in peace negotiation processes, etc., etc. If we look at women's participation in politics and in political decision making, we see also a huge gender gap that if we do not act, it would take us more than 100 years, to close the gender gap in political participation. And now, just to go to the point, I think that in the same way, after the end of the Second World War, today we are also living turbulent times with great uncertainty and fear. I think that COVID-19 has forced us to look ourselves in a mirror, to recognize we live in an interdependent and interconnected world. It made us realize how frail we are as a species, how interdependent. Now I think it is time, as I mentioned at the beginning, time for reflection, time for creativity, time of opportunity, of a narrative of hope. We know that we cannot go back to normal, because normal was the problem, in the first place. So inequality, poverty, conflict, the nuclear threat are not normal. We need, we are repeating this phrase over and over again, but we need to build back better. But the only way to do it is with a world free of nuclear weapons, free of the nuclear threat. There is a need for a call to humankind, to every human creature, to be agents of peace against a nuclear threat, which could and can, even today, wipe us all out. This is not a secret. And here are some numbers, but I'm sure you are the experts on nuclear disarmament. But 2,000 nuclear tests have been conducted since the end of the Second World War, with devastating consequences for people and our planet. And the effects on lives, livelihoods, human health, soil, groundwater, animals, birds, etc., etc. It's all well known. I don't need, this is of course a well-informed audience, but we all know that differences, the struggle to deliver on the disarmament agenda, to fight, a nuclear armed world can only be addressed through dialogue, through multilateral cooperation. we cannot even contemplate, the destructive power of the world's existing nuclear arsenal today. And I think that nuclear weapons are totally at odds with our commitment to 2030 agenda on sustainable development and the rebuilding of a post-COVID world. Not only do they affect people, but they affect the planet, our prosperity, our ability to forge the solidarity and partnership we need. And so just to close, some quick takeaways. Number one, we seriously need to address the implementation deficit. If we could only deliver on the UN disarmament agenda to unlock the sometimes hopeless conference on disarmament, we need to deliver on the NPT and to make the historic nuclear weapons ban treaty a reality. If we would be able just, to keep our commitments and to deliver on them, we will be much better off. The billions wasted in the arms race in general, and nuclear weapons in particular, could very well serve our efforts to fight poverty and inequality for building back better. The number two takeaway, women. Women have to be front and center of any initiative, idea, recovery strategy, investing in women well-being, in our economic and political empowerment, including our voice and agency in disarmament affairs, in solving conflicts, really pays off. And there are numbers and statistics about that. Women are agents of change and peacemakers and peace doers. And the number three and last takeaway, as at the end of the Second World War, we need to reaffirm our commitments to the UN Charter, to the Declaration on Human Rights, go back to the basics. Multilateralism is not an option. It is the only way to address global challenges, such as disarmament, climate change, pandemics, inequalities, and poverty. So allow me to close paraphrasing the great Mahatma Gandhi again, and I quote him: "In a gentle way, together, we can shake the world and build peaceful, sustainable, and humane societies free of nuclear weapons." And thank you again, Ela and Alan, for bringing us together in this very special day. Thank you.
So much, Dr. Espinosa. Um, Indeed, your words are, greatly moving and inspiring. We all stand on the shoulders of the great women who came before us, like Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit and the many other great women. So thank you for raising those issues. And thank you for talking about the legacy of Gandhiji as well. We need those words now more than ever before. I have pleasure in calling the next speaker, Ms. Nuria Azamatova, and she is from Kazakhstan, the most nuclear bombed country in the world. Over 450 nuclear test explosions took place in this country. She will speak to us about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons on current and future generations. Over to you, Ms. Azamatova.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And I will first share my screen. Yep. So can you hear me well and see the presentation? Yeah, thank you. So hello everyone, my name is Nuria Zamatova and I'm from Astana, Kazakhstan. I'm more than honored to be one of the panelists on today's amazing webinar. Well, I would like to start with the concept of teaching the history of nukes at schools in Kazakhstan. About 2 years ago, I was sitting in the history class. Our teacher was covering the topic of nuclear weapons. In fact, that wasn't the first time I got to learn about Kazakhstan's active involvement in the issues related to nuclear weapons. No wonder why. Our people were forced to endure the horrible testings of the nukes for decades, so naturally the rumors have spread all across the country. Yet that day, the thing that took all my attention was Olja Suleimanov's truly historical figure's speech. I'm going to show you a short excerpt from the video I got to watch during my history class back then. Um, I made the subtitles myself, so probably there are some mistakes. So, my apologies in advance for that. As for the context of his speech, initially Olja Suleimanov and other Kazakhstani writers were planning to hold a meeting for book lovers. However, an urgent issue of the immediate radioactive gas redirected the whole purpose of the meeting. Can you hear it? So,
Любят жизнь, которые хотят бороться за жизнь на своей земле. Последней каплей для нас стало последнее атомное испытание на полигоне под Семипалатинском. Вырвался газ, радиоактивный газ. Хотя специалисты говорят, что это благородный газ. Но в это очень трудно поверить, тем более, что если бы ветер подул в другую сторону, по расчету, считалось, что он подует в сторону Абаевского района. А он неожиданно подул в сторону военного городка. И поэтому стало известно, что газ все-таки неблагородный. И это облако заставило зашкалить все счетчики Гейгера. Мы, писатели, получаем каждый день письма из тех районов, расположенных вблизи полигонов, где приводятся потрясающие нас факты вымирания целых семей. Никакие соображения обороны уже не заставят нас соглашаться с атомными полигонами на территории республики.
Uh, that day, 28th February 1989, became a historical event. Such a magnificent performance led to the very creation of the Nevada Semipalatinsk movement, for it has influenced many people to start peaceful demonstrations. The same year, the movement has stopped several nuclear testings planned in the Semipalatinsk. Specifically, out of 18 explosions planned, 11 has been prevented. The last one took place on October 19th. Sure enough, Olja Suleimanov's mastery of speech got me thinking about the Semipalatinsk tragedy. After that one history lesson, I learned that 340 underground and 116 atmospheric explosions were conducted on the venue of Semipalatinsk. Yet numbers can merely describe the horrific experience the whole nation gained. That's precisely why we need to look at the art depicting the horrible aftermath of the Semipalatinsk venue. There is this amazing story called The Last Exhale, written by Duman Ramazan, a Kazakh national writer born in 1967 within 200 kilometers from the testing venue. Unfortunately, I haven't found any official translations for this piece as well, so here's my unofficial translation to English from Kazakh. Oh my god, he was sick. The baby was torn in two, nostrils protruded from the palate, and he was born half dead, poor boy. He only breathes through his mouth. Sometimes there is not enough air, but at least someone stutters and swells, said the old mother, wiping tears from her eyes with the tip of her head. This excerpt illustrates the sorrow of the mother who gave birth to the sick son. Given the result of the irradiation, it has been born with the syndrome called kylosis. I hope I am pronouncing it correctly, and hence has been struggling with the very simple yet vital function, breathing. Next, please go ahead and take a look at these astounding paintings. They resemble quite a utopia, the world of peace, calmness, and from my perspective, simple happiness. They were drawn by Karibek Kuyukov, an artist and nuclear non-proliferation activist born without arms as a result of his parents' exposure to the radiation from nuclear weapons testing. Here's his quote, and I would like to read some of these sentences out loud. The people who lived in Semipalatinsk at the time came out of their homes during the explosions to watch them. They didn't even know about the health threats and devastating consequences of the crimes being committed against them. At that time, we were told radioactive substances do not affect flora. What a terrible lie. Overdoses of radiation cause human beings to suffer from cancer tumors, skin cancer, and leukemia. These are death sentences. This is how Karibek Kuyuga feels about nuclear weapons. Full of frustration and despair for my people, I couldn't agree more. The death sentence can't be removed from the people it has been set on. Although we still can prevent the next generations from suffering. No matter what, generations, no matter what, people should be safe uh, and free of the terror brought by nuclear weapons. The world can't afford any more victims. Following the path of Uljat Suleimanov, Duman Ramazan, Karibek Kuyukov, activists all around the world, including speakers on this event, the youth as well can spread peace and help propose sustainable development. For sure, among youth, I'm not the only one who shares this position. While working on the Youth Peace Week and other projects, I found out that many adolescents are eager to fight in order to protect other people, even those whom they don't know personally. The top priority is the people and not the technological advancement, nor the politics of the country. While some governments still deny or neglect the mistake of nuclear weapons usage being previously done, it is our duty as youth activists to make them acknowledge it and afterward learn from it. Of course, none of these thoughts would have sprung in my mind if I never had laid my eyes on the historical masterpieces back then. The legacy of nuclear disarmament has led me to this point. I believe that the elderly nuclear non-proliferation activists serve as the Generation Z, the best teachers we could have ever imagined. Every generation and nation united, I believe we can make the world a better place. A place where no radioactive gases are being emitted to the villages. A place where a mother does not cry for her child who is unable to breathe. We could build a world of peace, calmness, and simple happiness. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ms. Azamatova. It was really an, you know, moving description of what happens, how the radioactive, nuclear has an effect on future generations, particularly children. And I can see how, people need to really look at what is going on, especially in terms of the radioactive emissions that we have. Thank you for that very concise report. Our next speaker is Ms. Davina Malone, and she is an African youth working on peace, disarmament, and COVID-19, and she will also give us a youth perspective. The floor is yours, Davina.
So thank you for giving me the floor. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So, hi everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Can enlarge your transparent. Can you take away the sidebar?
I can't get you.
Davina, we're seeing your table of contents, so your PowerPoint actually hasn't opened. It's only showing a preview at the moment. You probably
Okay.
need to double click on your PowerPoint to open it.
Yeah.
Is it okay?
Yep, that's good.
Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Divina Malum. I am the winner of the International Children Peace Prize 2019 and the founder of Children for Peace. I first would like to thank the Almighty God who gave me the opportunity to be invited in the global as a speaker in the global webinar intitulated The Legacy of Mahatma Gandhi for Protecting Current and Future Generations. I'm going to present on the theme Peace, Nuclear Disarmament, and Non-Proliferation in Africa and the world. Conflict is still Africa's biggest challenge. Here are some images. The first image shows girls abducted by terrorists to falsely be their wives and used for horrendous purposes. The second shows girls abducted during the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon. This image too shows a girl recruited by terrorist groups in the far north of Cameroon as a suicide bomber. The main causes and characteristics of conflicts in Africa. You know, many of the current conflicts are driven by prospect of political power or financial gain, with armed groups fighting to acquire valuable mineral resources. Some of conflicts appear because of incumbent regimes dominated by elites whose approach to governance is influenced by their desire to protect their own interests and the interests of their constituencies. Others have been challenges to sitting government based on the profound disagreement over governance and legitimacy. Some of conflicts have been leadership struggle between more or less equal resources, armed faction, as was the Mozambican and Angolan conflicts. You know, the feeling to be marginalized, corruption, poor governance, and incapacity of the state to address poverty, unemployment, suffering, existential, identity based antagonism characterized by ethnic, religious, and political rivalry and transnational alliance. There is also the socioeconomic marginalization, low literacy rate, and vulnerability in areas affected by conflict. Here we're going to focus on some ongoing conflicts in Africa and their consequences. The Democratic Republic of Congo is one of Africa's deadliest, with the involvement of about 20 different armed groups fighting each other, while others from neighboring countries use the Congolese territory to launch attacks on their home country. Over 5 million people killed and about 732,000 new displacements were recorded. You know, in South Sudan, sorry, persisting tensions over natural resources, specifically access to the oil field in newly independent South, causing about 380,000 killed and more than 2 million forced to flee their homes. And the ongoing conflict in Liberia that began in 2011 after the collapse of Muammar Gaddafi's regime center mostly around the control of territory and oil field, causing over 1,000 people killed and more than 128,000 displaced. In Somalia since 1991, Al-Shabaab continues to launch attacks against civilians and the government, causing the deaths of thousands of civilians and the displacement of over 2 million people. In Mali, after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, several armed groups with sophisticated weapons emerged, and the Central African Republic has suffered more than 6 years of complicated conflict between Seleka and Anti-Balaka with over 600,000 people internally displaced and thousands have been killed. Boko Haram in Cameroon is operating in Lake Chad Basin since 2009, causing from 2011 and 2015 over 2.3 million displaced, and the number is still counting in Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, Niger, and Benin. And the war between the state and the separatists has so far made over 3,000 killings and forced more than 700,000 people fleeing across the border into Nigeria. Here, we're going to analyze the consequences of conflict on African youth and children. There are many consequences. I'm going to cite few. We have the increase in poverty, youth unemployment, and challenges to reconstruction. There is the drastic decrease of school enrollment rate and increase of illiteracy. There is early marriages, the increase of early marriages in many families, and the children and youth abducted, girls targeted for particular horridors abuse. And there's also the intensification of illicit proliferation of small arms and light weapons. Understanding COVID-19 impact and the need of a ceasefire in Africa. Coupled to ongoing conflict, the COVID-19 is causing deleterious effects on nutrition of the most vulnerable, especially children. COVID-19 is causing historical levels of unemployment, limited access to food, and humanitarian assistance. COVID-19 too is weakening of several health systems with restrictive sexual reproductive health and rights for women and girls, and an increase of gender-based violence, illiteracy, and child marriage. COVID-19 too is exhibiting already high level of inequality. Children for Peace engagement against COVID-19 for the global ceasefire and religious imperative for peace. Here is an image where we were leading inter-community children peace camp to teach children to live together. Children for Peace is a children and girl-led movement created in 2015, working across Cameroon and Africa for children rights, gender equity, peace building, and to increase the number of children participating in public policies. We also mobilize children and teenagers in complex cultural and religious background and affected areas by war to define and implement action plans and several local and nationwide activities. We also make them understanding the fragility of the Black race in this world. We help children and teenagers understand human rights challenges, the importance of diversity, intergenerational, interreligious, intercultural dialogue. We teach them that all the races are equal, that Black lives also matter, and as girls and children, they should always stand up non-violently to defend rights. We also teach them the power of love, compassion, and forgiveness, and that what brings men together is more important than what divides them. Here are images of the life skills and social support to affected girls and children in returnees and host communities. Here we're having an advocacy in the national televisions on the importance of ceasefire and more protection for children's rights in areas affected by conflict. Here we're having a mass sensitization of children in human rights, gender equity, and conflict resolutions in schools. Here we had an open dialogue and a mass sensitization with women and girls on the rights and against early marriages. Here we're having a capacity building with girls in leadership for peace building, non-violence, and human rights. Here too, we were with inter-community peace camps with women and girls, refugees, and internally displaced in affected areas by war. We have been implementing the project Silence the Guns and have constituted a network with some Muslims and Christian religious traditional leaders and local authorities and civil society in several affected areas, engaging them to work with children and teenagers against identity-based differences. We also mobilize them in community-based conflict through activities consisting to build relationships between the antagonists to find gender-sensitive approaches to dealing both with conflict, pandemic, and the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. Here is an image of an advocacy meeting with several traditional and religious leaders for interreligious dialogue and increased collaboration with children in peace building and non-violent conflict resolution in North Cameroon. We have been implementing the project Girls' Voice Against COVID-19, which aims to mobilize and engage girls against the pandemic and involve them to tell their stories, advocate regarding the impact of COVID-19 on their lives and community for a quick recovery. Here are some screenshots of their memes. Here too is an image of the advocacy with community leaders and local authorities to increase the participation of children and women in peace building and for more protection of girls' rights. Here we're leading children to tell their stories and expectations through painting and drawing meaningful tools for education and advocacy for peace building and human rights promotion. Regionally, we work closely with some regional organizations as African Network of Young Leaders for Peace and Sustainable Development to mobilize youth and women to implement innovative initiatives to address security crises and contribute to the mitigation of the impacts of pandemics through One Health and Eco Health for All. It is the case of the project we have been creating disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration technology for ex-child soldiers, the DDR Tech, which is an application that will contribute in Cameroon to reduce by 25% incidents caused by weapons. We also have the African Youth Resilience Initiative against COVID-19 and pandemic, which aims at federating children, youth, women, and civil society organizations. At the global level, we work with international organizations as parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, the PNND, on Fold Zero Abolition 2000, and Move the Nuclear Money Campaign for the implementation of the United Nations Secretary General Global Ceasefire to several projects. To conclude, by following the religious imperative for peace, we call all religious leaders to teach the above religious imperative and reinforce joint actions for peace. We call children, youth, women, civil society, NGOs to work closely and intensively with legislators and local authorities for disarmament and for a nuclear prohibition treaty. We call states to negotiate global agreements to prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons and human killing technology. Here too is an image where we're having a peaceful march in the northwest of Cameroon. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Davina. And I want to thank both the young people, Nuria and Davina. A wonderful presentation by young people. You really inspire us. Our hopes lie in people like you for the next generation and for the world. So continue with the good work. Impressive testament of what you are doing here. Thank you for that. Our next speaker is Miss Lynette Wairimu Ngayu. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Lynette is coordinator of the disarmament program of African Council of Religious Leaders. She is affiliated to Religions for Peace and a co-sponsor of this webinar. She partners with us in this webinar and will speak to us about the African position. Over to you, Lynette. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ela. It's such a great honor to be part of this webinar. It's a great honor to be part of this webinar commemorating the legacy of the great Mahatma Gandhi. So, unfortunately, I can't start my video because of streaming. Please forgive me on that. I'm trying to share my screen. Just give me a second. So for my presentation, what I'll do, I'll just give you a brief on our work as the African Council of Religious Leaders and what we have been able to do as a council in terms of nuclear disarmament. Sorry, this is taking a while. Not sure why I'm not able to share my screen. Oops.
Elaine, can you help?
Oh yeah, I just managed. Thank you. Yeah, great. So here we are. Yeah, so I'll just share briefly what we as the African Council of Religious Leaders, Religions for Peace are working towards in terms of peace, nuclear disarmament, and non-proliferation in Africa. So we are the Continental Pan-African Organization of Religions for Peace, and we were established in 2003 when senior religious leaders on the continent realized the need for a multi-faith platform. So we have different faith communities among us. We have Christians, Muslims, the Baha'is, the Africa traditional religion, the Hindu, the Jewish community, and they are all over the continent. Currently, we have 31 national affiliates, which we call the National Interreligious Councils. We also have a women platform, which is the Africa Women of Faith at the regional level, as well as an Africa Interfaith Youth Platform, which is also comprised at the national level. And at each National Interreligious Council, we also have a women and a youth network. We are also formed in terms of the regional geographical blocks, and this is in the east, west, south, central, and the Indian Ocean Islands. So we have national interreligious councils forming what we call hubs so that they are able to exchange views and ideas in terms of political leadership and governance with the respective regional economic communities. So as an organization, our main goal is really peace. And our entry point into nuclear disarmament, of course, was by drawing from the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where there was such a huge humanitarian impact. The loss of human life, the destruction of property, the intergenerational impact on people, which we still see today with the Hibakusha, and the fact that religious teachings are more towards, the sanctity of life, protecting our common home and our environment. And of course, previously, before that, religious leaders had been involved in other disarmament campaigns, such as the landmines and the cluster munitions and the Arms Trade Treaty. And so when this opportunity came up, at least with the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, it was important for religious leaders on the continent to be part of this conversation, despite the fact that we don't have nuclear weapons on the continent. So in terms of Africa, when we look at really our peace framework, we have the original blueprint that the continent looks towards, and this is Agenda 2063. And under that Agenda 2063, there have been various frameworks and documents that have arisen that are really speaking to peace and security. One document is the Africa Peace and Security Architecture, which is really the framework that helps in the promotion of peace, security, and stability on our continent. And it supports three main organs, which is the African Union, the regional economic communities, which I'll mention later. These are in the west, south, and the east and central, and also the regional mechanisms and this architecture facilitates these organs in terms of conflict prevention, management, and peace building. So with this architecture, there have been different roadmaps that have been enabling the implementation of this structure. So the current one, which was the APSA roadmap, was concentrating on 5 thematic priorities. And for purposes of our discussion today, we are looking at strategic priority 4, which is concerned with strategic security issues, which the the AU has listed out as small arms and light weapons, and the threat and risks of illicit chemical, biological, and nuclear proliferation and trafficking. So the other framework that we also look towards is silencing the guns by 2020. So this is a flagship project, which was formulated by the African Union with the aim of ensuring that we have peace on the continent, that we are able to realize peace and to rid our continent of especially civil conflict, human rights violations, disasters, and violent conflicts. So, of course, at the different sub-regional levels, we have legislative framework. And if I can add, what our continent is really suffering from in terms of disarmament is mostly on small arms and light weapons. So a lot of the national, sub-regional, and regional legislation is really on small arms and light weapons. So if we jump to now nuclear disarmament, we have the African Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Treaty. This is also called the Treaty of Pelindaba. And as a treaty, it prohibits the research, development, manufacture, stockpiling, acquisition, testing, possession, and stationing of nuclear explosive devices anywhere in the territory of the African continent. We all know that South Africa voluntarily decommissioned its nuclear weapons, I think in the early 90s, 1994. So in essence, there is no African state that possesses nuclear weapons. Of course, the question is then why should we be involved in this conversation? So here I'm showing the Treaty of Pelindaba and the number of signatories that it has. That is 53, with the exception of South Sudan, I think, because it's still a young state, and it has 42 state parties. And at the global level, I have concentrated my presentation on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is the roadmap that the Religions for Peace Family Act and as a global movement have seen as the pathway towards nuclear disarmament. So currently we have 84 signatories, and 26 out of these 26 are African signatories, and currently we have 42 state parties, where we have in Africa the Gambia, South Africa, Namibia, and Lesotho. So just a brief on the TPNW. This was an action by states and civil society over a long period of time. We started with the humanitarian impact the humanitarian impact conferences around 2013. The first conference was in Oslo, and there was a subsequent conference in Mexico and another one in Norway. And from there, Austria took up the humanitarian pledge that essentially got into now the UN open-ended working groups and a lot of negotiations. And finally, this treaty was adopted in July 2017. And this is the first treaty that prohibits the possession of nuclear weapons. So as a council, what exactly is our strategy, right? So basically, we have an African position and also a global, the Religions for Peace Family global movement position. And these two tools, we are using them to build the capacity of our religious leaders, and they also document that they can present during their meetings with policymakers to strengthen the resolve of religious leaders as active champions of nuclear disarmament. And of course, at each country level, working together with the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, we have briefing papers on each country on the status and what comments or any quotes that ministers or government delegations have ever quoted on the need for a nuclear ban treaty. The other thing is really the correlation between the Treaty of Pelindaba and the TPNW and other weapons of mass destruction treaties. Nuclear disarmament is still quite, I can't say foreign, but we need to help our population get acquainted and really take it up that it is a conversation, a dinner table conversation. So this correlation with, say, the Treaty of Pelindaba that most states have signed helps states understand then that the TPNW is really just a global instrument that would reinforce what the Treaty of Pelindaba caters for. The other one is our strategy, which is also a very, very important tool, is the access of faith leaders to high-level diplomacy. Religious leaders have all these spaces opening up for them in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Office of the President, with the regional economic communities, and with the African Union. So our work really, especially as Secretariat, is just to be technical persons accompanying religious leaders in these high-level meetings. And with the state of COVID, religious leaders were part of task forces that were reporting to these offices of the president. So we are still seeing how can we still be able to get into that pathway and bringing other issues such as disarmament. And definitely our congregational model, where we have a top-down and top-down and down-to-top approach and implementation of action, such that when the local imam is able to give a sermon, which is really my next point, at the very top, the Islamic Council in a particular country has already taken up that issue. So it's the actions are trickling up and down so that we can be able to reinforce the pressure of towards governments really making the true commitment towards nuclear disarmament. Yes, and I've also mentioned about now the sermons and the teaching. So we really emphasize to faith leaders to incorporate sermons and teachings within sermons and teachings on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, issues to do with the divestment and cutting military spending in their sermons and teachings. And this way it's able to get to the wider public. And we have allocated 6th to 9th August, which is the anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, as days of prayer, as well as 26th September. And of course, the involvement of women and youth leaders cannot be emphasized enough. Youth leaders are very instrumental, especially on social media platform, and pushing that narrative and ensuring that that particular demographic within that space understands why they need to have to ensure that there's no proliferation, and also the need to ban nuclear weapons specifically. Women leaders are really great in terms of assisting with compliance and drawing on the sustainability of efforts. Yeah. So just briefly, this is sort of how the continent works and our structures of engagement in terms of the governance structures. At the African Union, we have the Peace and Security Council. We have the Peace and Security Council, and under that, there's a Peace and Security Department, which is the technical arm of the Peace and Security Council. So this approach to the chairs of the Peace and Security Council have been very fruitful. In 2019, in February, we were invited by Nigeria to a Peace and Security Council consultative meeting. and we were able to give our views on why African states um, need to sign and ratify the treaty. So that has been instrumental. I had mentioned about the hubs. These are the sub-regional groupings of national interreligious councils, and they work together with the intergovernmental organizations as well as the regional economic communities. So in the photo to the left, this was a delegation of senior religious leaders from the Eastern African hub that had gone to the East Africa community to impress on this sub-region on the need for states to ratify the TPNW. And of course, now we are also working with national interreligious councils to approach their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, cabinet or offices of the president or parliament, so that we can be able to push, understand the status of the treaty and see what we can do to facilitate that process. Lastly is really the opportunities and the challenges, and I group them together because with every challenge, I see an opportunity. And of course, every opportunity comes with a challenge. So the number one challenge in Africa is priority. I think nuclear weapons is still a topic that is not part of everyday conversation. And even with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they will be dealing with other treaties or other conventions vis-a-vis this. So the bureaucratic system is not very open to sometimes other issues that they don't think as priority. So our counter to this has always been, if it's not a priority, then it's better to just get it over and done with, sign and ratify. You're already part of this legislative framework at this level, so it is easier for you to just sign or ratify the TPNW. The other one is education and awareness, and this is for the public, the faith actors, and policymakers. So this is very instrumental towards opening up the nuclear disarmament conversation or debate. So sometimes when you go to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it's not clear who is handling the file on nuclear disarmament, or if that particular person has the technical know-how on what are the elements and why these elements would not be counter to national legislation. Definitely the proximity. This is something with the French test in Algeria in the 1970s. This has helped us sort of indicate to governments, especially, that tests have already been done on the continent. So this is a real-time challenge. So we can't say that we've not been affected. And Algeria is one of the main champions of the TPNW. So these efforts towards seeing that it is not a Western problem, and that regardless, a nuclear detonation would not be respectful of national boundaries, whether you're a nuclear weapons free zone or not, is a real time thought that we should always have. Definitely the relationship between the different regional and international instruments help, such as the Treaty of Pelindaba and the TPNW. That's a very good opportunity. Sometimes the challenge with that would be, why do we have to sign two treaties that speak to the same thing? Of course, in Africa, this is a particular problem where there's suspicion on international instruments, especially after there were reports on the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute seemingly or allegedly being used in some quarters and not in others. The biggest opportunity also we have is the goodwill of faith leaders as emissaries of peace, especially within the political and governance structure. So yeah, thank you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Lynette. Wonderful presentation of what's going on in the continent and also of the power of faith-based communities, especially when they come together as a united group. And I think that the question of unity has been sufficiently covered by you here. How important it is for all of us actually to unite. Um, we've been given already the global position, the position from the side of you. We've seen the African position. Now we come to the South African position, and I call on Dr. David Fake, who is the next speaker. He is an expert on nuclear programs in South Africa and abroad. He also works on issues of peace and the environment, and he will give us the South African perspective. Over to you, Dr. Fick. Dr. Fick?
I'm trying to get my...
Okay. Are you?
Just a moment. Hello.
We can
Can
hear
you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure why my screen is not working, but I'm going to talk anyway. Would that be okay?
Yeah. Okay. Have you tried sharing the screen?
I don't know why it's... I'll try again. There we go. Is that better?
We can see you, yes, and hear you.
Okay. Well, firstly, thank you for the invitation. It's a real privilege to be working with everybody here today. And my experience is rooted in the South African example, but I wanted to make some observations because we are a wider community of how Africa has been integrated into the nuclear value chain. And ever since the atomic weapons were put together in the Manhattan Project in the United States, it was a multinational effort between the US, Britain, and Canada in the 40s. The uranium that was inserted into the nuclear weapons came from Africa. It came from what was then the Belgian Congo, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So from the very birth of the nuclear industry, Africa was involved. And we've heard also that there was a search for uranium deposits around the world, which fed into the bomb-making programs of these countries at the end of the war. So my country, South Africa, they had been mining gold and dumping the waste of the gold mining onto the landscape because they didn't realize that within that waste, there was a significant amount of uranium, which was never previously commercialized. But after World War II, the British and the Americans signed these secret agreements with the very new apartheid government in order to purchase that uranium to put into its weapons programs. So once again, we were very much integrated into the global nuclear weapons trade. Similarly, we've already heard that Algeria was used for testing nuclear weapons by the French during the 50s and onwards. And we know that that weapons were put together by the apartheid government in South Africa from 1978 to 1990, at the height of the most aggressive period of the apartheid government, where it was in a corner and it really thought that nuclear weapons would help them out of the corner. It wasn't clear who these bombs would be dropped on, but millions of currency were used to go nuclear, to build the weapons. And only when it became clear that apartheid was at an end did the outgoing apartheid government cancel the program, canceled the weapons program. They shredded all the documents related to that program, and their aim was for the technology not to end up in the hands of the incoming democratic government. So these are the ways in which Africa is integrated. We also have various uranium mines across the continent in places like Namibia, Niger in particular, very strong, and smaller deposits all over the continent, including Malawi, where the only mine in Malawi was a uranium mine until recently when the price put it out of business. So we have a long relationship to all these processes. The uranium, of course, can only go into weapons or into nuclear reactors. And my biggest concern is that there's quite a deep silo between those campaigning against weapons and those campaigning against the future use of extra nuclear energy. And why I say that is because one of the biggest threats to proliferation of nuclear weapons is the existing nuclear industry, the energy industry, because there are so many parts of that industry where people who want to proliferate can take the products that are being used for energy and turn them into weapons. And we see the concern about that being expressed in relation globally to the situation in places like Iran, where countries are prepared to go to war to stop the Iranians from developing weapons out of their knowledge of the nuclear industry. But this could happen in all sorts of other countries where the technology to create nuclear energy appears in those countries. The worrying concern about Africa is that more and more African governments are turning to the suppliers of nuclear energy reactors to build these reactors on their territory. This is very alarming in the case of a number of countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Egypt, and a number of other countries have expressed the need to go nuclear in terms of energy creation. Now, we all want energy. There's a big energy deficit in our countries. But instead of using dirty energy like nuclear energy, we should be really investigating cleaner and greener methods of producing energy for all. Nuclear energy is also very concentrated in the hands of one or two plants. And so when things go wrong, they go badly wrong for millions of people. Now, we've seen clear examples of that in countries like Japan and Ukraine, Chernobyl and Fukushima in particular. So the industries are subject to human error. They're subject to nature, as in the case of Japan, where there was a tsunami and an earthquake. Excuse me. And we cannot really regard nuclear energy as a safe source for all time. It needs enormous security around it. It needs enormous management skills. The nuclear waste is a big problem in itself that comes out of these reactors. Excuse me. And as a result of all this, we really have a set of problems if we go nuclear. And just relating also to Davina's presentation, we see conflict breaking out all over Africa. We see many governments facing insurgencies, and without judging the merits of which side to support, the point is that building nuclear reactors could open the way to all sorts of actions, whether insurgency or not, that would jeopardize the people's safety and make the possibility of proliferation once again coming to the fore. So we have to bear in mind that when we talk about nuclear energy, we really have to say that it's not the safest form of energy. It can get into the wrong hands. It's also a problem for the legacy of waste that is used, that is experienced, that it's a terribly expensive and very, very centralized form of energy, and it doesn't serve the people in the way that we have a number of alternatives deriving more from other parts of nature, like solar or wind or tidal energy. And Africa's rich in solar and rich in wind, so we can turn to those possibilities. So why do countries want this technology? I think that at one stage, countries were arguing that they want to take their natural resources and get the most value out of them. But when we think that only of all the countries that were wanting nuclear energy, only South Africa and Niger are real producers of uranium. So the other countries are not such big producers of uranium, so we can't use that argument that they want to beneficiate their natural wealth in uranium. We do want mass electrification, but I've already said this is not really the way forward. We want security of supply, which nuclear doesn't guarantee us. Even if we, as African countries, buy nuclear reactors, we become very dependent on the countries that supply the nuclear power facilities and power plants. So what are those countries? There are only a handful of countries producing these power stations. Russia, China, United States, Japan, France, South Korea. And because they are so expensive to build and they're so technologically complex, we will become dependent on the finances of those countries. We will become dependent. We'll get into terrible debt over them, and they are very, very expensive. They probably are the costliest forms of infrastructure we will ever have to invest in. So, and then the countries supplying the reactors will also have a technological hold over our energy production system. So it's not a good thing where compared to the other forms of energy, which can be locally controlled, locally produced, where communities can have control over the energy that they are using. So, so one of the other reasons that our leaders want to go nuclear is the encouragement given by the suppliers of these reactors. And also, to go back to the whole architecture of non-proliferation, we've heard today that two of the key instruments guaranteeing non-proliferation in Africa are the Treaty of Pelindaba, which creates an African nuclear weapons-free zone, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Lynette also mentioned, which is a global treaty trying to stop proliferation. But when we look up close at it, it's only trying to stop proliferation in the countries that do not yet have nuclear weapons. It turns a blind eye to the fact that 7 or 8 countries already have these weapons. and they are not penalized under that treaty. They are not expected to disarm under that treaty. So we find that even the instruments of non-proliferation are quite problematic. The Treaty of Pelindaba says that all the member states must give up their weapons or not create conditions to make weapons. They must not trade in nuclear waste. But we find that there are a few holes in the Pelindaba Treaty. One of the holes is that certain colonial countries that still own islands offshore in Africa are exempt from signing that treaty. So, for example, we've heard some of us about the problems of islands like Diego Garcia, which is was to go to Mauritius at independence. It was always ruled as part of Mauritius. But at independence, the British kept that island and its surrounding islands and turned it into a British colony that wasn't given independence and rented to the United States military to set up a base in the Indian Ocean. And the US, we know, has used that base in the wars against Iraq, Iran, and so on, has used it as almost like Guantanamo, as a place where prisoners have been kept, especially on ships offshore the islands. The islanders themselves were uprooted from their homes and sent to Mauritius as refugees, and they have been winning court cases in the UK to challenge Britain's inability to give independence under Mauritius to those islands, so preventing them from going home. Unfortunately, the way the US base is operated, they may never be able to reutilize their natural resources ever again. But that's created a problem, and the Treaty of Pelindaba does not mention, or it doesn't help us to overcome that tangle between the different nations. So the instrument that we have and the third instrument I want to mention is the International Atomic Energy Authority, which is a UN body based in Austria, in Vienna, which promotes nuclear safety, but it doesn't. There's nothing stopping it from encouraging governments and populations to accept nuclear energy. It very much, like the vendors, the people in manufacturing nuclear reactors, very much wants the industry to expand. So the instruments, and the same thing goes with the non-proliferation treaty. It does not say anything to stop the proliferation of nuclear reactors. It only stops or wants to stop nuclear weapons. And I'm saying there's such a strong connection between having nuclear energy and being able to build nuclear weapons, that the very instruments that we have set up globally to try to control disarmament and try to control nuclear proliferation are flawed very badly, because they are also the instruments used to encourage nuclear reactors in our countries. So we, as the disarmament movement or the energy movement, should stand together to try and understand better this connection, and to try and understand that it's pointless us arguing for non-proliferation of nuclear weapons without also campaigning against nuclear energy in our continent, and uranium mining, which has been very destructive to the populations that are involved in uranium mining. Let us work together and go forward in a way that recognizes this as a problem and helps us to overcome the problem across our continent, and to make Africa not just a nuclear weapons-free zone, which is more or less achieved, but also a nuclear energy-free zone. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Fig. That was really very informative talk on nuclear energy. And yes, let us unite against nuclear energy as well, so that we can keep Africa free of nuclear, um, emissions and all those hazards involved in that. Our next speaker is Dr. Tamara Lawrence, and she is also an environment worker, and she will comment on military's impact on the environment globally. Over to you, Dr. Lawrence.
Hello, everyone from Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. It's wonderful to be with you all. I'm going to share my slides. I hope you can see my slides and hear me okay. So I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the neutral peoples of the Grand River. In my brief remarks, I'm going to speak to you about Canada's involvement in nuclear weapons production, what I learned about Gandhi when I was in India, and about the climate and environmental impacts of militarism. So it was not only Congolese uranium that was used in the American atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, it was also Canadian uranium that was used. In the 1940s, the Canadian government had the Satu Dene, the indigenous people of the Northwest Territories, pack and carry uranium ore in sacks south for the Manhattan Project. But the government never told the indigenous people that the ore was radioactive and dangerous. And over the decades, many Dene people died of cancer. When the indigenous people learned that the rocks that they carried were used to make bombs that were dropped on Japan, they were very distressed and remorseful. In 1998, the Dene people went to Hiroshima to apologize to the Japanese people. However, the Canadian government has never apologized to the Dene people or to the Japanese people. And shamefully, the government of Canada is refusing to join the new Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons because of our membership in NATO. This is a poster of Gandhi and his quote on nuclear weapons. Gandhi said, "The atomic bomb has deadened the finest feelings that have sustained mankind for ages." This poster was hanging up at a conference that I attended and spoke at in October 2014 in Nagpur, India. The conference was on youth, peace, disarmament, and development, and it was organized by the All India Peace and Solidarity Organization and the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. While I was in India, my host took me to Gandhi's ashram called Sevaragram, which means the village of service. And today on the webinar, I'm wearing the traditional Kati shirt that I bought at the community store that is affiliated with the ashram. Kati is the hand-woven cloth that Gandhi encouraged villagers to spin and to make their own clothing for rural employment and self-reliance. In the 1930s, Gandhi organized boycotts of British cloth. It was a form of economic non-cooperation and a form of non-violence. Unfortunately, when I was in Nagpur, people told me, but there is a lot of suffering in the rural communities and that there are many farmer suicides because their crops are failing from excessive heat. According to the Global Climate Risk Index, India is ranked 5th most affected country by climate change in the world. India has been affected by extreme heat waves and flooding across the country and cyclones on its coast. The index and report were produced by German Watch, a non-governmental organization that promotes global equity and sustainable livelihood. And it's been producing these reports for the past 13 years. And as you can see in this chart, Canada is ranked 9th most affected by climate change. Yet if you look in the last column under the Human Development Index heading, you see that Canada is ranked 12th highest in the world for human development, but India is one of the lowest ranked countries in the world for human development at 130th. So Canada, as a wealthy Western country, can cope better with climate-induced natural disasters than India. Let's look at another chart together. This is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's latest report on trends in world military expenditures. And you can see in the arrow that India is ranked third highest in the world for military spending. Last year, India spent $71 billion on its military. It is very sad that one of the countries with the lowest human development scores and most threatened by climate change spends so much money on the military. 2 months ago, India received its first batch of French fighter jets, the Rafale fighter jets. They bought for $16 billion. And as you can see in the chart as well, Canada is ranked 14th highest in the world for military spending at $22 billion. Last summer, the Trudeau government announced plans to buy 88 new fighter jets for $19 billion. It's the second most expensive procurement in Canadian history. In Canada and in India, and I suspect elsewhere, politicians never ask about the environmental and climate impacts of this defense procurement, let alone inquire about the social consequences of these new fighter jets. The military, an institution of state-sanctioned violence, is the most environmentally destructive. Countries like India, Canada, the United States are spending most of their public funds on an institution that kills people and is killing the planet. The research that I'm doing right now is on the climate and environmental impacts of militarism. I'm not a doctor yet. I'm doing my doctoral research now. I'm just a grad student. But did you know that the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels on the planet is the US military? There was a very important report that came out last year by the Costs of War Project at Brown University. It's entitled Pentagon Fuel Use and Climate Change. I encourage you to look at it. The report explains that the US military consumes more oil and emits more carbon emissions than 140 countries. Military vehicles like fighter jets, tanks, warships, they all consume a lot of fossil fuels and they're extremely energy inefficient. For instance, the carbon emissions from one flight of a fighter jet is equivalent to all the emissions of a car in a year. Military emissions are also exempted from the national greenhouse gas reduction targets. The military is also one of the largest consumers of hazardous material and producers of hazardous waste. In the United States, there are thousands of highly contaminated Superfund sites across the country, and of course at US military bases worldwide. Every aspect of militarism, from the manufacturing and testing of weapons, the war games and the war cause toxic contamination, destroys animal habitat, and harms the natural environment, our life support system. Western countries like Canada and the United States are militarizing the African continent. The United States has established Africa Command, AFRICOM, to train African armies and to supply weapons and to conduct military operations right across the continent. In February this year, Canadian Special Forces were training African police under US AFRICOM. I am also very concerned about NATO's growing presence and partnership with the African continent. NATO is a US-led nuclear-armed military alliance. NATO is also undermining the United Nations. Remember, in 2011, it was Canada that shamefully led the NATO bombing of Libya, one of Africa's richest countries that is now suffering with ongoing chaos and a refugee crisis. US AFRICOM and NATO are causing Africa's underdevelopment. And they do not want Africa to be a zone of peace. They want Africa to be a zone of conflict so that they can continue to operate in the area. In December, I wrote this article, NATO is one of the greatest threats to climate change. I'm happy to share this article with you. In Canada, the organization that I'm with, the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, we have a campaign, Women Say No to NATO. We are building a national movement to get Canada out of NATO and to help abolish the alliance. And we would like to work with you and partners around the world to try to end this military institution. In July of this year, the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, we hosted a webinar, NATO and US AFRICOM, the racism and violence of militarism at home and abroad. I urge you to listen to it. In Canada, we also have launched a new campaign, No New Fighter Jets. We had a national day of action in July, and we are going to have another day of action to put pressure on the Trudeau government to not spend $19 billion on new fighter jets. Our next day of action is Friday, October 2nd, and we've timed it to be the International Day of Nonviolence and, of course, Gandhi's birthday. I would also like to welcome you all to Canada next year. In June 2021, we are having a major peace conference that's being hosted with World Beyond War. And we're also going to be having a major protest against the largest arms fair that takes place in North America that happens to be held every spring in Canada's capital in Ottawa. And we plan to use nonviolent direct action in the spirit of Gandhi to shut down CanSec, and we hope that you will join us. Finally, when I was in India, I was shocked by the pervasive poverty, the hungry and homeless people all over. At the Nagpur Peace Conference, the youth said to me that they want peace with their neighbors, Pakistan and China. They don't want war. They don't want their government to buy new weapons. They want development. The truth is that we must demilitarize and disarm for sustainable development and climate justice. It is impossible for us to build back better, to meet the Paris Agreement, and to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals if we continue to spend so much money on the military and to continue to allow military emissions. We must have the courage to say no to nuclear weapons, no to NATO, no to US AFRICOM, and no to militarism, and yes to peace. And we need to do this collectively. I'm happy to share my slides and my resources with you. And thank you so much for inviting me today.
Thank you so much, Ms. Laurenus, for this enlightening and powerful message. Yes, we will join you, and united we can. We can make things happen. So let us all unite together. The last speaker on this webinar is Dr. Alan Ray. And I just want to say that he is from New Zealand, and he is a global coordinator of parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, and much more. You'll read it there on the screen. But he has been a pillar of strength in moving this campaign, and in the last few weeks, he has been working tirelessly to help me with ensuring that this webinar takes place. I'm really deeply grateful to you, Dr. Wei, for all your help and your support. He will be speaking in the panel on, well, he is going to cover all the bits and pieces that haven't been covered. And I think one of them would be how the military spending can be diverted to sustainable goals. So over to you, Dr. Wei.
Well, thank you very much, Ella. It's a great honor and privilege to be engaged with you in helping to organize this event and also to be sharing. We have spent some very interesting times together, Ella, you and I, in Geneva or in Kazakhstan, where we went to the ground zero, you know, the place where the nuclear test took place many years ago, and even, you know, with the final test way back in 91 and the final atmospheric test back in 1963, ground zero in Kazakhstan is still so radioactive that we had to wear face masks, not to protect us from COVID-19, but from the radiation still in the area. And if you remember, Ella, we were only allowed to be in there for, I think, like 12 minutes was the maximum. So, and Ella led a wonderful blessing at the Ground Zero in Kazakhstan to remember the legacy of the nuclear age and to look forward to an age where we'll have a nuclear-free world. So it's wonderful to be sharing that vision. And also, I'm quite happy to be coming at the end. I'll try and keep quite short because so we've got some time for questions and answers. But I think I come in with some examples that the message of hope is realistic, that we can actually change politics, that we can change policies and positions, that we can move into a better world. And I speak a little from the experience as being a New Zealander and how we've changed policies in our country, but also some of the things that are happening in the world. And even the horror of the pandemic has actually woken people up to new ways of operating and new frameworks for security that, that espouse militarism. We know that none of the armies in the world and none of the nuclear weapons in the world could prevent the pandemic from spreading. What's required in order to build health and security, is investment in people, investment in peace, investment in health systems, international cooperation. And these are coming to the fore, I think, as we emerge from the pandemic and build a better world. And it's wonderful that Maria Espinosa was able to join us because she's been at I guess the chalkboard of this, working with leaders in the world and with the key bodies in the United Nations, which we don't hear often about in the media. So often in the media, we hear the bad stories where things fail, but there has been so much good work that's been happening through the different UN bodies, UNDP Development Program, UN Environment Program, the World Health Organization, the Secretariat of the United Nations, the President of the General Assembly, who's been managing to organize UN meetings to continue in a virtual or hybrid basis, even during the pandemic. And all this has been engaging with the new ideas about how we're going to build a better world emerging from this. So I think that that there are messages of hope, even within all the horror stories that we've heard about militarism and despair. From the New Zealand side, it's great to be on this panel with many South Africans. We normally meet on the rugby field or on the cricket pitch, and it's good to be meeting in a peace environment. And we share some commonalities. We've heard from a couple of the speakers that South Africa gave up its nuclear weapons, which is quite phenomenal. And regardless of the reasons, some may say it was, to make sure that the bomb didn't fall into the hands of a democratic government. But others, and I've heard, some of the government members from South Africa and others, talk about, there was actually a rethinking of security also. As the Cold War ended, the security in South Africa was seen as like in a different context, and that the nuclear weapons were part of the Cold War framework. And so that emerged. For New Zealand, it was a bit different. What we saw is that, because we had been under the nuclear umbrella, we were part of the ANZUS, Australia, New Zealand, US, a little like Canada has got this relationship with the United States at the moment. But what we started to see in our country was that military alliance wasn't actually helping us. It was drawing us into wars. It pulled us into the Vietnam War. It pulled us into the Malaya War. And it wasn't helping us in our times of need. For example, when we were getting affected by the radiation from the French nuclear tests in the Pacific, the United States our ally never came to our aid. It was the United Nations that came to our aid. We took a case to the International Court of Justice against France, and that was basically how we got France to stop nuclear testing. When we had a case of terrorist act in our country, it wasn't the United States that came to our aid. They kept silent. Even though they were opposing state-sponsored terrorism in other parts of the world, they were silent when there was a case in New Zealand when our peace boat got blown up. Again, it was the United Nations. It was the good offices of the United Nations Secretary General which mediated that situation. So more and more people in New Zealand, along with education, which was very important, realized that diplomacy, peace, international law conflict resolution, negotiating with others, was much better than building up militaries and trying to resolve our conflicts and our disagreements through threats or through military operations. So that was really important in shifting New Zealand, which was one of the supporters of nuclear weapons, to now being one of the champions of nuclear disarmament. So this now brings me to, how do we convince those who still rely on nuclear weapons, which is very important. We've heard about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is a very good initiative. The New Zealand government was the co-chair of the negotiations in 2017, and we were very engaged in this. And it's good that countries, non-nuclear countries, are joining it. It'll strengthen the force of the non-nuclear countries, just as the nuclear weapon-free zones strengthen the voice of the non-nuclear countries. But in terms of engaging with the nuclear weapon states, it's not a very good vehicle for doing that. Why? Because it doesn't address any of the issues that are why countries still feel they need to rely on nuclear weapons. The threats from neighbors. There is nothing in the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that would provide verification for disarmament, that would provide enforcement, that there is no phased process for the elimination of nuclear weapons. There is no security mechanisms, unlike the regional nuclear weapon-free zones, which all have security assurances for those countries that sign on. There's nothing like that in the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And there's no dialogue process. I remember during the negotiations, Netherlands was there in the negotiations and was putting forward some suggestions about how you could get nuclear allied states into the treaty, and they're all rejected by the negotiators. So while it's a good thing for non-nuclear states, it doesn't, the nuclear armed states and the allies have all said no, they're not going to join. So how can we engage with them? And that's where we have to look not just at the government level, but at all the levels of civil society, parliamentarians, mayors, women leaders, religious organizations, and realize that a country is not the government position. A country is a collection of all sorts of organizations and people, and we can engage at all levels through citizen diplomacy, through dialogue between the religious organizations, through the parliamentarians. And in those countries, the nuclear armed states, many of these organizations are very active. In the US Senate, we have real champions for nuclear disarmament, like Senator Markey and Eleanor Holmes Norton, for example, putting forward some really good initiatives, acts like no first use, like taking away the authority from the US president to unilaterally launch a nuclear war, like putting diplomacy first in dealing with North Korea, not the threat to destroy North Korea, through supporting the Iran deal. So there's a lot of work at the parliamentary level that we can support with if we can't get much progress at the government level. I mean, trying to negotiate with the Trump administration at the moment is pretty impossible. And so that's where many of us instead are focusing on getting the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then maybe we'll have a better president next year. So these are some of the ideas. And I think one of the opportunities that's coming up next year is the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in January. There'll be a new US administration, hopefully it'll be a good one. And in that, we've seen in the past that there have been some really positive breakthroughs with non-proliferation treaty review conferences in both 2000 and 2010, when we had some good leadership and it paved the way for some really good initiatives. 2010 helped the Iran deal very much to get consolidated in the Senate and started the process for a Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone. 2000, put forward 13 practical steps for the elimination of nuclear weapons, and also reaffirmed the importance of non-use of nuclear weapons. So that's coming up, and there is this initiative from Sweden, the Stockholm Initiative, which is actually an interesting mix of non-nuclear states and allied states like Japan, South Korea, Germany, non-nuclear states like New Zealand and Kazakhstan and Austria, that are working together to try and put forward a program that they can talk with the nuclear armed states and get them to lower their rhetoric, to reduce their threats, and start to pave the way for the elimination of nuclear weapons. So there are some good initiatives out there. I'll quickly turn now to nuclear energy, because that's another area where I think there is positives. We've heard about the problems of nuclear energy. We have been told that by the nuclear energy industry that we have to have nuclear energy in order to protect the climate. it's false. These are basically lies from the nuclear energy industry. Nuclear power plants, or putting money into the nuclear energy, is like the worst way to try and deal with the carbon emissions, because it takes so long for nuclear power plants to be built that they're not contributing anything anyway for a long, long time. They take so much money and there's so many risks. And if you invested that money instead in the renewable energies, it's not just solar and wind. They are two important ones, but we also have water energy, which is only just starting to come off, wave energy, tidal energy, etc. These are possible to meet energy needs. They come online so much faster, they're much more democratic, because for a wind turbine or a solar panel, villages can install them. They don't have to wait for a big power plant to be built somewhere away from them and then get an energy line to come into their village. They can get energy really, really quickly through these alternative means. In New Zealand, we made that decision about 20 years ago, that nuclear energy is a dead end. It's a waste of money, it's too dangerous, and we can meet energy needs. And we are easily able to meet our energy needs through renewable energies and phase out fossil fuels without having to replace it with nuclear energy. So look to the success stories. It is possible to change from relying on nuclear weapons to instead relying on the United Nations, on international law, on diplomacy, etc. It's possible to get rid of nuclear energy and rely instead on the renewable energies. And the last thing I want to put forward is we have a big opportunity with the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And I will share, if I can find it. Where's my website? Just a minute. Sorry, I have a screen here, which I'm hoping, there it is. Share. So we have a big opportunity, because this is the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and there are a lot of events coming up where we can demonstrate the possibilities of peace and disarmament, where we can demonstrate the connections between peace, disarmament, protecting the climate, and also achieving sustainable development, and where we can build cooperation between the communities working on these issues. That is the UN Day for Peace, which is September 21st. There's the Sustainable Development Summit, September 21st to the 24th. There's UN Climate Week, 21st to the 27th. There's the UN Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, the UN Summit on Diversity, the UN High-Level Meeting on Women, and the UN Day of Non-Violence. Now, normally, these are like separated out, segregated, and some people are working on one thing and other people are working on others, but more and more we realize the connections between these, and by building on the connections, we can help each other and ensure success. So we're launching today, actually, this platform, We the People's 2020, which will highlight, these events, demonstrate the connections. So we have here the connections between peace, climate protection, sustainable development goals, disarmament, and building a better world following the COVID-19 pandemic, highlight the different events and the days, actions that you can do and how you can participate. So we welcome everybody to be involved in this. We'll share the link in the site, and this will give us more opportunity following this webinar to also be engaged together on other webinars and other events. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Ray or Elaine. That was really a powerful, presentation. And yes, we must all get together in this new initiative that you have taken for September and October. Definitely in some of the programs, we will partner with you. And I encourage everybody else to do the same. Can you help me with the questions and answers, Dr. Ray?
Yeah, there is one that Hafsat Abiola asks, which might be good for David to have another response to. I think he touched it very briefly. But the question from Hafsat Abiola is, why are African countries exploring nuclear energy? What's the rationale? Is it cheaper? And why are they doing this? Thanks. David, you need to turn on your sound. You're muted.
Is that better?
Yes.
Thanks. There are a number of reasons for this. Firstly, I'd like to say that the ideology of development is a big reason given by governments. There are many African countries are short of electricity, and so they think this is a magic bullet to be able to suddenly build, well, it won't be suddenly, it'll be over many years, building a power station that would feed into their national grid. The illusion about that is that you have to have a grid already in place that's about 10 times bigger than the amount of power that you're going to get from the nuclear plants. And Nigeria, which needs electricity the most, I would say, has got a very small national grid. Even Kenya's grid is not sufficient yet for the ability to connect nuclear power to the grid happening very easily. So people are misguided about the fact that this will bring development to those countries. Secondly, they have a false belief that nuclear will give security of supply. But we know that with South Africa's experience of having 2 nuclear power plants, that every 18 months the one power plant goes down because it's got to be maintained while they change the fuel, and it's not really a wonderful secure supply. There have also been lots of outages in South Africa. The life of the existing reactors are coming to an end, and there's a big debate going on about whether you can even extend that life. The industry wants to extend it by 20 years, and we are arguing that the reactors get too brittle and they get too difficult to be able to survive a further 2 decades without breaking down and leaking and creating real problems. As I said, countries want security of supply, but what they do is buy into a dependency on the supplier and on the source of uranium and on the financial bodies that will have to be lending them the money to afford such a huge, big initiative. A lot of countries want to do it out of elites feeling the need for prestige, thinking that this is modernization, this is comparing themselves with the number of nuclear countries, nuclear energy countries that already exist. But we know that there's a lot of bribery and corruption between the vendors and governments, and so there's a lot of rent seeking by the elites who think they'll get good fortune out of these contracts. And then finally, the encouragement by the International Atomic Energy Agency, by the European Union, which incidentally has a training program for Southern African nuclear engineers and others in Kazakhstan, of all places. So we heard earlier this evening about the role of Kazakhstan, and we really need to make connections with Nuria and her movement in order to monitor what's going on in terms of the EU, the European Union, paying for African scientists and others to get nuclear skills in a training center in Kazakhstan. And there's also pressure, obviously, from Russia, China, and some of the countries that build these reactors that think that they need the markets, they need access to African uranium. So these are all a multiplicity of reasons why these things are going ahead, despite the logic and despite it being anti-development and tying up countries in great debt and environmental problems.
Ella, there's another question that perhaps Maria and I might be able to answer. But just before that, I just want to say there are a lot of incredible people who have joined as participants. We want to thank them very much. Reverend John Onakayan, John Onakayan, for example, who was, I think, the Religions for Peace coordinator in Africa for a while. Jeremy Corbyn, who was the leader of the UK Labour Party, is on as well. There are quite a few others. Noel Stott, who's an expert in the African nuclear policy. And there are some others that are participating. So thank you very much to everybody who's participating. There was two questions that I thought Maria might like to have a look at, and I might also give a response to, from Fritz Pointer, one on the very first resolution of the United Nations, which was in January 24th, 1946, which was to establish a commission for the elimination of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. And then also there was a promise in the UN Charter to review the UN Charter in order to improve the UN Charter. And was there any meaning, or is there any value in that resolution and that promise in the Charter if they haven't resulted in what they aimed for? I'll give an initial response to this and then pass over to Maria. I think we'll have something to say also. With regards to the first UN resolution, I think it was part of a series of UN resolutions and other events that have been really important in building a taboo against the use of nuclear weapons that has ensured we haven't had a nuclear war so far. Now, it's a shaky taboo, and we can't rely on it, which is why we have to move towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. But I think that we need to actually give thanks to the fact that we haven't had a nuclear war, that since the nuclear weapons were first used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they've been in the arsenals now of 9 nuclear armed states, and there have been really close calls, that they haven't actually been used. There is like a fire block or a taboo that has sort of developed. And I think the first UN resolution was part of that, as was a number of other UN resolutions, the International Court of Justice decision in 1996. So I think there is a value, even if we haven't seen the final result, which is the total elimination of nuclear weapons. They've actually given us breathing space to get there. On the review of the UN Charter, that one has been really, really difficult to implement because of the review process. In order to review the UN Charter, you have to have the agreement of the Security Council and the UN General Assembly. And the Security Council, the P5, the permanent 5 members, all have veto power. So to actually get any official changes in the UN Charter, for example, or official change of the structure is really difficult. But that hasn't stopped an incredible development in UN mechanisms that have developed regardless, without having to get the official approval of the Security Council. The whole UN peacekeeping, for example, wasn't in the original charter, and that's now incredibly helpful in terms of monitoring and ensuring peace agreements are being kept. The mediation services of the United Nations weren't officially in the UN Charter, but now the mediation services have helped with so many conflicts, and I mentioned the New Zealand France one as one of those. So there are many developments that have happened even without having to have formal review of the UN Charter. That means that the UN has kept up to some degree with changing circumstances. But I'd also mention that UN 2020, which we're cooperating very much with, has also been looking at additional ideas for how to strengthen the United Nations, given the constraints, and will ensure that there is the link to UN 2020 in the chat box as well. So now pass over to Maria, because of her experience as being president of the UN General Assembly, to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I actually agree with everything you said before, but I'm struggling with identifying which question I should address, because just now I had trouble internet connection when you said the question out loud. So please.
I was passing to Maria Espinosa as the former president of the UN General Assembly, because she's got a lot of experience on how the United Nations operates. These were specific questions about United Nations resolutions and review of the UN structure.
Oh, yeah,
Sorry,
sorry.
Maria. It's to Maria,
Yes.
not Nuria.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but
I
you
mean,
can
first,
come in, of course, because I think it's very important to have, fresh perspectives on how to retool, because, I think we are in a moment of retooling and rethinking and reforming. And I think that I really admire and at the very optimistic take of Alan on the work of the UN. I think this narrative of hope is what we need. And just to share that there are ongoing negotiation processes, both for the reform of the Security Council in terms not only of its composition, but also on the exercise and use of the veto power and all of that. As you might imagine, it's a very contentious, difficult negotiation process that is being, going on for the past 15 years under a formal negotiation. So this is a continuing process. It's ongoing. It's not easy. It's one of the most difficult issues that I had to deal with when I was president of the General Assembly. But, there is movement, at least, which is, I have a little bit of hope on that front. And there is another process, which is, doesn't make, front lines, como se dice, headlines in the newspapers, which is the revitalization of the General Assembly, which basically is a process encompassing 193 member states, looking at how to improve the power, the traction, and the teeth of resolutions that the General Assembly passes. Because one of the issues, why is that people are saying we need a retooling of the UN, we need a rejuvenation of the UN. They're saying that, first of all, because there is an inclusion deficit. The voices of civil society, the voices of the youth, of women, of persons with disabilities. So I think that there is an inclusion deficit. But also there is, we have to acknowledge that there is a trust deficit on the ability and the capacity of the UN to deliver, to implement, to be relevant. The theme for my presidency was to make the UN relevant for all. The issue of relevance. And I think that there is a lot of work to do. And when I was asked as president, but the UN should do this and that, and the UN is stopping short to respond to this and that, I said, well, basically, we are the UN. It is about we the people, after all. And I think that we do have a shared responsibility on that. There is a call in the UN 75 political declaration, a call to the Secretary General to pursue a process of global dialogue, of interaction, and of citizens' participation in the UN we want and the UN for the future. And that has to include the voices of all of us. And this morning, prior to this webinar, I took part of a meeting of the UN 75 team. And what we saw is that there is acknowledgement and knowledge about the UN. People like the UN. You show the flag of the UN and people, feel, sympathetic to the organization, to the blue flag and all of that. When you ask people what the UN does, what the UN is, blank, because there is a communication deficit as well. So I think that, to make the story short, that we do have an opportunity, that building back better, we are, hearing building back better, building back better, building back better, not only our world free of nuclear weapons, hopefully, but also to build back better our multilateral system. And I think that there is appetite for that. And I am also a stubborn optimist. And I think that we do have a role to play. We do have a voice, and we do have a responsibility to improve the United Nations. I think the UN is irreplaceable. It's the best thing. And as Alan said, at least we haven't had another nuclear war for the time being, but it doesn't mean that we still are under this global, nuclear threat. So basically a call, an invitation to join forces and just make the change happen. Just paraphrasing in a very drafty way the great Mahatma Gandhi words, we have to unite and we have to have, our voices heard. There is space, there is opportunity, there is appetite for a retooled United Nations. And there are processes that are ongoing, but they need voices like yours, to feed into this conversation of reform and retool. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, Elaine, we don't have more questions, but people are asking how they can get access to all the information. I think it has been recorded and we are going to be sharing it on Facebook and other media. Right?
Yeah, so we can follow up after this event with an email to everybody who registered and participated with a link to the recording in case people want to look over it again. And what we can also do is we can copy a link to the chat box, because in the chat box, people were sharing links to events and other resources. So we can also include that, which we'll send an email to everybody, hopefully by tomorrow afternoon. If not by then by Saturday. We just have to make sure that we've got everything downloaded and got the links and things like that. Yep.
Okay. So should I conclude? Or do we have some more time? I'm not sure. It's 7:54.
I suggest just to give the floor, if there's any of the other panelists wanted to respond to anything else, just for a couple of minutes, and then we can wrap this up in 5 or so minutes.
Just round up. Give us a short last, message from each panelist. Okay. Shall I call them out?
Okay. Thanks, Ella.
So, would you like to go first, Dr. Espinosa? Would you go first?
Maria, she was asking you.
Yeah. No, you are muted.
Any closing comments?
Really, no, I think that we have had an incredible dialogue and conversation. I see a lot of interaction. Sorry, I was a little loud because I was reading the questions and interactions. It's full of that, which speaks well about this dialogue space. Just to say that I think we need the best way to prepare for Gandhi's birthday in October is to continue our hard work with hope, with strength, and we shouldn't dismay. We are facing one of the worst crises in the last century, perhaps, and I think that the voices, people's voices, and we the peoples, we have a very important role to play. And we have to see it, as the opportunity to rethink our world, to understand that we are interconnected, that we are a global family, and that peace has to be built, at different scales, from the grassroots to the UN, back to the grassroots, and that's where we have a role to play. Thank you, Ela Gandhi, again, for keeping Gandhi's legacy alive, and thank you all for the work, especially to the younger voices, to the younger generations, engaged, committed, working hard to make this world a better place. And thank you, Alan, always for your leadership, for your wisdom, for your optimism, and for your hard work as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Nuria, last words?
Yeah, sure. I think I would just like to thank you all, just all the panelists, all the guests that were listening to our stories, our amazing speeches and presentations. For me, it is just such an amazing opportunity to speak up, to represent the Kazakhstani legacy of being involved in the issues of nuclear weapons. I'm just so happy and kind of tired because it was thrilling experience for me as well. Thank you for inviting me as your panelist. It is a pleasure to perform the speech in front of you. Just thank you all. I am so grateful. Hopefully, we'll stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you. Lynette, would you like to say something? Last word?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Gandhi and Aline. It's been such a pleasure to be part of this webinar. Such a pleasure to meet virtually Madam Espinosa and David and Divina and Nuria. I believe that this pandemic has given us different opportunities for interaction, and we have an opportunity to spread our message on the total elimination of nuclear weapons to our different, whether it's the faith community, civil society. My emphasis is really on education and awareness so that everybody has this information so that we are all able to be part of the conversation. I believe that even if you are not interested in a conversation, the actions and initiatives in that conversation will still go on even if you're not involved. So it's best to be involved and to be empowered with technical information and knowledge on all these things. Thank you again for allowing me to be part of this webinar, and God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Vandana? Vanda? Oh no, you were upping. Okay. Divina.
I would like to thank you for inviting me in this global webinar. And I wanted to add that. Can you see me?
You can see you, but unmute, please. Yeah.
Stable connection here. So I wanted to add that I noticed that when government, civil society, and political leaders take decisions concerning children, they don't take the ideas that children have. Meanwhile, children are stakeholders and that they are capable to drive. I believe that they are capable to drive societal transformation. So I'm pleading on governments, religious leaders, and you all, the panelists, to help me in the activity I'm doing to engage children and youth and girls in peace building processes, because many of us want to see change in our community. And if you want to see change, you must be the change you want to see, because change is a change until the change changes the changer. So I invite all of you people to support me in the work I'm doing, because it's not quite easy for me to carry the activity I do.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
David, would you like to say something? Last words?
Yeah, coming up. Yeah, I just have the same sentiments. Thank you to Ella. Thank you to Alan for the invitation. it's been a great privilege to talk to you and be with you and share ideas. It's a very impressive array of presenters who are doing amazing work all over, not just this continent, but elsewhere. So I hope we learn from each other and take it forward in ways that are engaging and creative. And look forward to connecting with you all in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. Elaine, do you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's just a reminder that the core budget for the United Nations is $5.6 billion per year. That's basically for all of the key activities of the UN, with the exception to some of those that are independently or separately financed. That's about the same as the annual budget for the New York police force. Put that in context, the amount of money that's spent on the military every year is 1,900 billion. So that's many, many times more is invested in weapons and in militarism than is invested in peace, common security, diplomacy, global negotiations. We need to change that priority. That's something that we need to work with our legislators in every country and say, coming out of this COVID pandemic, if there's anything you've learned, it's that cooperation, health, investment in people, these are the things which are providing security for people. We need to invest in that, cut down on the military, put it into health, put it into the United Nations. I think that's a really important call that we can take forward. And the second thing I'll just mention is Gandhi's legacy, to end on that. I mean, Gandhi showed us a number of really important lessons, and one of those is that non-violence is both a spiritual response to injustice, but it's also something which can work because it appeals to the humanity in people. And that's not just in the humanity of those that we agree with, it's even more important to appeal to the humanity with those who we don't agree with, or we might have differences with. And that's how we need to address the situation. We need to change the framework of our security from how do we protect ourselves against enemies to how do we open up our fists and reach out, hold hands, learn about what the issues are and resolve those conflicts in peaceful ways. The UN was set up to do that. That is the fundamental core of the United Nations, was to prevent the scourge of war and to work for human rights, international law, and social and economic development. So we have a wonderful framework to do that. It's not perfect, we know, but we wouldn't be able to create anything nearly as good as that if we tried today. So we should use that, take the opportunity of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations to build the connections and elevate this important message of Gandhi of non-violence and of humanity and of resolving conflicts, not trying to threaten others or defeat them with military approach. So we're looking forward to working with all the people who have participated in this. There'll be other events like this, including on October the 2nd. There's going to be a number of events commemorating Gandhi's birthday. We will put them all up on the platform that we're launching today. There's a calendar, and if you're organising an event, you're welcome to post it on there. We'll share it with others. I know that, Ela, you're going to be, and the Gandhi Development Trust will be organising an event. And so we'll share that with people so they can see that non-violence is alive, that there's many people employing it. It operates in many different ways. I remember how illuminating it was when I read Gene Sharp's book about 191 different methods of nonviolence. I had no idea there were so many different methods of nonviolence, and now there is many more. That was like 25 years ago. So it's alive, it's vibrant, it works in many different ways, and it's beautiful the way that nonviolence is working around the world. And of course, Mahatma Gandhi was like an inspiration, and it's wonderful to be working with you, Ela, to continue that legacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I must thank Wanda for helping us with the whole project. I must thank Elaine for helping me with organizing this webinar. To all the speakers, the panelists, I think that we need to together take this message forward of nonviolence and how we can change people's mindsets, especially now when we are looking for a new way, a new normal. One of the things that we need to look at is how can we come together and negotiate peacefully to settle disputes or conflicts rather than resorting to violence, starting from the small level right until the nations of the world. So with that in mind, let's look at that and how we can all get together and do it and create this new normal so that our world can be a better world for the young people on this panel, as well as all the young people in the world. I think it would be something good to leave for them. Thank you so much to everyone, for all the participants, and to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.